Maribel Dawson picked up that letter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the cold kitchen floor right there in the middle of her dead mother's house and she laughed. Not because anything was funny, because she had nothing left to lose. She was 32 years old. She had been told she was plain, forgettable, and too ordinary for any man worth keeping. And now a wealthy rancher from Montana, a man with thousands of acres, and a name the whole valley respected, had written back. He wanted her to come. She didn't know whether to pack her bag or burn the letter. Before we go any further, if this story already has you feeling something, please hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to this channel. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter almost didn't get written at all. Maribel had sat at that small wooden table in her mother's kitchen for nearly 4 hours, staring at the blank page, holding a pen she'd already lifted and set back down more times than she could count. The candle beside her had burned down to almost nothing. Outside, the Kansas wind was doing what Kansas always did, cutting through every crack in the walls like it had a grudge. She'd been told about Elias Whitmore through her neighbor, an older widow named Ruth Calloway, who had a cousin in Redstone Valley, Montana, who knew a man who worked on Whitmore's ranch. The chain of connection was long and thin as a thread, but it had found its way to Maribel's door regardless. "He's looking for a wife," Ruth had said, leaning across the fence that separated their yards, her voice low like she was sharing something sacred. "A proper arrangement. He's a serious man, wealthy. Honest from what people say. Lost his wife some years back. He's not looking for romance, mind you. He's looking for someone to help run a household." Someone steady. Maribel had nodded and said she'd think about it. She'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. The problem wasn't that she wasn't interested. The problem was that she knew exactly how this kind of thing went. She had watched it happen before. A woman writes, a man responds. They exchange careful, polite letters full of careful, polite words. And then the man eventually meets the woman in person and realizes that what he imagined and what stood before him were two very different things. And then came the look, that particular look, the one that tried very hard to be kind but couldn't quite get there. Maribel had received that look before, more than once. The worst time had been 3 years earlier, when a merchant from Wichita named Gerald Holt had come through town and taken an interest in her through letters they'd exchanged over 2 months. She'd written him honestly. She'd told him she wasn't a society woman, that she'd spent most of her adult life caring for her sick mother, that she didn't own fine dresses or know how to play piano or speak French. He'd written back that none of that mattered, that he admired her practicality and her strength. And then he'd arrived and seen her face and her worn hands and her simple clothes, and something in his expression had shifted so fast it was almost invisible. Almost. He'd stayed for dinner because it would have been rude not to. He'd eaten 2 full plates and complimented her cooking 3 times. And then he'd left and sent a letter a week later, explaining that after careful consideration, he didn't think they were suited for each other. The whole town knew within a week. People were kind about it to her face. Behind her back, she knew the story was simpler. Gerald Holt had taken one look at Maribel Dawson and walked away. And now here she was, 3 years later, sitting at her dead mother's table, thinking about writing to a wealthy rancher in Montana, who would probably do the same thing. But her mother's house was cold, her savings were thin. And Ruth Calloway had said with the particular gentleness that older women use when they're telling you something, they think you already know, Maribel. Honey, you can't stay here forever, taking care of a house that's already gone quiet. You deserve a life of your own. So Maribel picked up the pen. She wrote carefully at first, formal, proper. She described her experience managing a household, her ability to cook and preserve and keep accounts. She talked about her years caring for her mother, about her knowledge of medicinal herbs and home remedies. She described herself as hard-working and organized and willing to adapt. She read it back. It sounded like a list of things a good servant might offer. Not a person, a list. She crumpled it up. She started again. This time she didn't let herself think too much. She just wrote the truth. Mr. Whitmore, I should tell you the truth before I arrive, because I believe you deserve honesty more than you deserve a pretty picture. I am not the kind of woman men usually admire. I have never walked into a room and turned heads. I am plain and I have known it my whole life, and I have made my peace with it mostly. I have spent the last 11 years caring for my mother, who passed 6 months ago, and before that I managed our family kitchen, our accounts, and our small property on my own. I am 32 years old. I am not young by the standards people usually apply to these arrangements. But I can cook in a way that makes people feel at home. I can manage a household without being told twice how. I know how to stretch $1 and make something good out of whatever is at hand. I know how to make a house quiet when it needs to be quiet and warm when it needs to be warm. If that is not what you are looking for, I will understand completely. I would rather you know the truth now than feel deceived when I step off the train. Respectfully, Maribel Dawson. She sealed it before she could talk herself out of it. She walked it to the post herself, in the dark, because she was afraid that if she waited until morning, she would find reasons not to send it. Then she went home and told herself to stop hoping. Elias Whitmore read the letter on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the big desk in his study with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold beside him. He had a stack of correspondence to get through: ranch business, a dispute about a water easement with a neighboring property, an invoice from the blacksmith that needed reviewing. He'd picked up Maribel's letter last, almost as an afterthought. He read it once. Then he set it down and looked out the window at the mountains for a long moment. Then he picked it up and read it again. He'd received 4 other letters in the weeks since word had spread through Ruth Calloway's cousin, through the ranch hand, through the usual invisible channels of small communities, that Elias Whitmore was open to a marriage arrangement. 2 of those letters had been so carefully composed that they read almost like business proposals. One had included a small portrait sketch, which Elias had set aside feeling vaguely uncomfortable, as though he'd been handed something he hadn't asked for. The 4th letter had been warm and cheerful, and had mentioned 3 times how much the writer had always admired successful men. He hadn't responded to any of them, but he read Maribel's letter a 3rd time, slowly, and then he did something he hadn't done in a long while. He laughed, quietly to himself with no one around to hear it. Not because it was funny, because it was the most honest thing he'd read in longer than he could remember. He picked up his pen. Miss Dawson, I appreciate your honesty more than you may know. I have found that most people tell you what they think you want to hear. It is rarer than it should be to find someone willing to simply tell the truth. I am 42 years old. I've been told I am difficult to know. I spend most of my time working and very little time talking about myself, which some people find cold and others find respectful, depending on their nature. I am not looking for someone to fill my house with noise. I am looking for someone steady, as you said. Your letter was the first I have received that felt like it came from a real person. If you are willing to make the journey, I will have the guest room prepared. There is no obligation. If either of us finds, after a reasonable time, that this arrangement does not suit, we will part as respectful acquaintances. The train reaches Redstone Valley on Thursday afternoons. I will be at the station, E. Whitmore. Maribel read his response standing at the post office counter, still holding the envelope, not even waiting until she got home. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it in her coat pocket, walked outside into the bright Kansas morning, and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a long moment, with her hand pressed flat against her coat where the letter was. The first I have received that felt like it came from a real person. She went home and started packing. She took the train 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, leaving on a Tuesday morning to account for delays. She brought one large worn suitcase, a smaller bag with her mother's recipe book and a few personal things, and the kind of quiet determination that comes from having already survived the worst version of a moment and deciding to try again anyway. The journey took 2 days and involved 2 changes of train. She sat mostly by herself. An older woman across the aisle asked her where she was headed, and Maribel said Montana, and the woman said, "Oh my, that's quite a trip," and went back to her knitting. Maribel looked out the window at the land changing, the flat Kansas plains giving way slowly to something bigger, wilder, more vertical. The sky got wider. The mountains appeared first as a thin purple line on the horizon and then over hours grew into something enormous and real. She had never left Kansas before. She had never seen mountains. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched them come closer and thought about the look. The look she would see when Elias Whitmore saw her for the first time. She had been preparing herself for it for 2 days. Rehearsing how she would handle it, how she would keep her chin level. How she would say something calm and dignified and not let him see that it cost her anything. She was good at that. She had a lot of practice. The train pulled into Redstone Valley Station at just past 4 in the afternoon. It was smaller than she'd expected, a low wooden platform, a few buildings visible beyond it, mountains pressing close on every side. The air when the door opened was cold and sharp and clean in a way Kansas air never quite managed. She stepped down carefully, her suitcase heavy in her hand, and looked along the platform. There were maybe 15 people, a few families, a couple of men in working clothes. A woman greeting what looked like a daughter, and then a tall man, standing slightly apart from everyone else, in a dark coat and a plain hat, watching the train. He wasn't what she'd imagined. She'd built up a picture over the weeks of correspondence, wealthy rancher, serious man, 42 years old, and somehow her mind had given him sharp edges, a certain coldness in the face. The kind of expression that belongs to men who are used to evaluating things and finding them wanting. But the man standing on the platform didn't look like that. He looked like a man who was tired. Not the tired of someone who hadn't slept, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles into the bones of a person who has been managing everything alone for too long. His eyes found her before she'd taken 3 steps. She stopped walking without meaning to. This was the moment. She knew it. She could see it happening, the 2 seconds where his expression would tell her everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. She'd learned to read those 2 seconds like a language. She braced herself. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked forward, crossed the distance between them without hurrying, reached down, and took her suitcase from her hand. "You must be tired," he said. "The ranch is 2 hours away." "I had dinner prepared, that was all," no assessment in his eyes. No careful rearranging of his expression. No performance of courtesy that barely covered something else underneath. Just, "You must be tired." Maribel realized she'd been holding her breath and let it out slowly. "I am," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." "Elias," he said, already moving toward where a horse and wagon waited at the edge of the platform. She followed him, and for the first time in longer than she could name, she didn't feel like someone being judged. She felt like someone being collected, brought somewhere. Like she was expected. It was the strangest feeling she'd had in years. The ride to the ranch was quiet, which suited them both. The last of the afternoon light was turning the mountains gold and purple, and the road wound through open land that was bigger than anything Maribel had ever stood inside of. She kept looking at it, the sheer scale of it, the way the sky went on forever in every direction. "It's bigger than I expected," she said after a while. "It is," Elias said. "Do you ever get used to it?" He thought about that for a moment before answering. She noticed that about him he didn't answer quickly just to fill the silence. He actually thought about things before he said them. "I notice it less than I used to," he said. "I reckon that's not quite the same as getting used to it." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I found it's the only kind worth giving." She almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, because she was still too careful, still too braced for something to go sideways. But almost. The ranch house was enormous. She hadn't quite understood, from the letters and the descriptions she'd been given, what large ranch house actually meant in Elias Whitmore's case. It wasn't just large. It was the kind of house that had been built, not just for a family, but for a future broad porches, high ceilings, enough rooms that you could live in one corner of it and never encounter whoever was living in another corner. And it was beautiful in its way. Good wood, good bones, everything solid and well made. But it was cold. Not temperature cold, something else. The particular coldness of a house that has all the right pieces and none of the life that should fill them. Furniture that nobody had sat in lately. A fireplace that had clearly been lit but seemed to warm only the air directly in front of it, not the room. Everything clean and cared for, but in the way of a place that is maintained rather than lived in. A woman came out to meet them when they pulled up, older, broad-shouldered, with gray streaks in dark hair and the expression of someone who had outlasted many things and intended to outlast several more. Miss Dawson, Elias said, "This is Dorothy Bell. She's been with the ranch longer than almost anyone." Miss Dawson, Dorothy's voice was even, not unfriendly. "Cautious, Mrs. Bell," Maribel said. "It's just Dorothy." "Supper'll be ready in 20 minutes. Mr. Whitmore, you've got a message from the Fenwick property about the north fence." "I left it on your desk." Elias nodded. "I'll see to it after we eat." He looked at Maribel. "I'll have someone show you to your room. Get settled." "There's no rush for anything tonight. I'd rather see the kitchen," Maribel said. Both of them looked at her. "The kitchen," Dorothy said. "If that's all right, I'd like to know where things are. I don't like feeling like I don't know where things are in a house." Dorothy studied her for a moment. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in the older woman's expression, not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. "Come on, then," Dorothy said, and turned back toward the house. The kitchen was the best room in the house. That was Maribel's first real thought about the place. Everything else might be cold and echoing and too large, but the kitchen was right. Big iron stove, well seasoned, good ventilation, deep shelves stocked with more than she'd expected. Dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams in careful bundles. "You do the hanging yourself?" Maribel asked, looking at the herbs. "I do," Dorothy said. She was watching Maribel move through the space, tracking how she moved, what she touched, and how she touched it. Maribel was aware of being evaluated and didn't mind it. This was Dorothy's territory, and Dorothy had earned the right to evaluate it. "You've got a good eye for it," Maribel said. "The placement is right." "Not too close to the heat." Dorothy didn't say anything. "The lavender and the rosemary are good neighbors," Maribel continued, reaching up to touch a bundle carefully without pulling it down. "You separate them from the stronger ones. A lot of people don't bother. It changes the taste of everything if you don't," Dorothy said, a little stiffly, like she was agreeing with something she hadn't intended to agree with. "It does," Maribel said simply. She turned and looked at the stove. "What are we having tonight?" "Beef stew, cornbread." "Apple cake." Maribel paused. "Would you mind if I helped? Not to change anything." "I just think better when I'm moving." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. "Wash your hands first," she said finally. It wasn't welcome exactly. But it wasn't a wall either. Maribel washed her hands and picked up a spoon. Dinner was served in the large dining room, at the long table that was built for a family and currently served one man. Elias ate without ceremony, with the focused quietness of someone who eats because it's necessary rather than because he particularly enjoys the ritual of it. He did notice the food, Maribel could tell, because he paused twice, eating more slowly than she suspected he usually did. "Dorothy outdid herself," he said, near the end of the meal. "Miss Dawson helped," Dorothy said, from the doorway, in a tone that committed to nothing. Elias looked at Maribel. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at his plate. "It's good," he said, "just that." But she noticed he finished everything. After dinner, she sat alone in the guest room, which was clean and comfortable, and had a window that looked out toward the mountains, invisible now in the dark but present somehow. A vast darkness that she could feel even if she couldn't see it, and she thought about the day. She thought about the platform and him taking her suitcase. She thought about Dorothy watching her hands in the kitchen, and finally slowly handing her a second spoon. She thought about the dinner table with its single chair worn different from all the others, the one spot where one man had eaten alone for years, until the wood itself had learned the shape of his solitude. She didn't let herself feel too much. It was too early. She had been here less than a day. She had been wrong before about what a place might become. But she let herself notice that she had not seen the look. Not once, not on the platform, not in the wagon, not at the dinner table. And that after everything was more than she had thought to ask for. She turned down the lamp. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and very quiet, except for the distant sound of cattle and the wind moving through the dark grass. She pulled the quilt up to her chin. She thought maybe. And then she made herself stop thinking and go to sleep. In the days that followed, Maribel found her footing gradually, the way water finds a way through, not by forcing anything, but by moving steadily and patiently into whatever small spaces offered themselves. She was careful not to overstep. Dorothy's kitchen was Dorothy's kitchen, and Maribel understood that without being told. She helped when she was invited to help and stayed out of the way when she wasn't. She didn't suggest changes. She didn't rearrange anything that hadn't been arranged wrong in the first place. She watched, mostly. She learned the rhythms of the house. The ranch hands ate their main meal midday in a long, low building separate from the main house. The food was solid and sufficient. Dorothy knew how to cook for large numbers efficiently, which was its own skill, but Maribel noticed that the men ate fast and left fast. The way men do when eating is a task to complete rather than a moment to sit inside of. One morning she asked Dorothy if she could try something for the midday meal. Dorothy looked at her with that careful, measured gaze. "What kind of something?" "Biscuits," Maribel said. "My mother's recipe. They take about an hour. I'll do all the work." "You don't have to change anything else." Dorothy considered this for a long moment. "They'll eat whatever you put in front of them," she said, which wasn't a yes but wasn't a no either. Maribel took it as a yes. The biscuits were good. She knew they were good before she put them on the table. She knew from the smell when they came out, from the weight of them, from the particular color. But knowing a thing yourself is different from watching strangers encounter it for the first time. The ranch hands hit a pause when they tasted them. Not a big pause, just a moment of attention before they went back to eating. But one of the younger men, maybe 19, with a sunburned face and a shy disposition, looked up and said, "Ma'am, these are the best biscuits I've had since my mama made them." Maribel said, "Thank you. I'll make 'em again Thursday." She could feel Dorothy watching from across the room. On her way back through the kitchen, Dorothy said, without looking up from the pot she was stirring, "What's in them?" Maribel told her. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "You use lard, not butter?" "Both," Maribel said. "Half and half, and buttermilk, not sweet milk." Another silence. Dorothy said. Which was, Maribel was beginning to understand Dorothy's way of saying something mattered. Elias noticed the biscuits too. Dorothy mentioned them to him briefly in that casually informative way of hers. He didn't say anything about it to Maribel directly. But 3 days later, when she was in the kitchen helping Dorothy put up preserves, he appeared in the doorway still in his ranch coat, clearly just in from the range, and said, "I heard there might be leftover biscuits from yesterday." There were not in fact leftover biscuits. Maribel was fairly certain he knew that. "I could make more," she said. "Only if it's not trouble," he said, which was so transparently polite as to be almost charming. "It's not trouble," she said. He stayed in the doorway while she made them, not talking, not getting in the way. Just present in the way of a man who wasn't quite sure he was allowed to be there, but hadn't yet found a reason to leave. She handed him the first one, warm straight from the pan. He ate it standing up in the doorway. "Good," he said. "Your hands," she said. He looked down at them. He'd been working on fencing all day, she could tell by the marks on his palms. He'd also apparently cut one, which had been field patched and had not been properly cleaned. "It's fine," he said. "It will be once it's cleaned properly," she said. "Sit down." He looked at her. People didn't generally tell Elias Whitmore to sit down in his own kitchen. But he sat down. She found the clean cloths and the iodine and the proper bandaging without asking where they were, because she'd made it her business in her first week to know where everything in this house was. She cleaned the cut without fussing over it, and without making him feel foolish for not having done it himself. "This happens more than it should," she said, wrapping his hand carefully. "Ranch work," he said, "I know. But you're not careful with yourself." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been managing on my own a while," he said. "You stopped noticing some things." She tied off the bandage and looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not guarded exactly, but careful. Like a man standing near a fire after a long time in the cold and still not quite sure whether to step closer. "You take care of everyone on this ranch," she said. "I've seen it. The workers know it. Dorothy knows it." He said nothing. "You take care of everyone except yourself," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. "Nobody's ever said that to me before," he said. Not defensive, just true. "That doesn't mean it isn't so," she said. She stood and took the cloth to the basin, and he sat there at the kitchen table for a long moment before he got up and went back to work. But something had shifted, small and quiet and hard to name the way the best changes always are. Something had moved. It would be too easy to say that the house changed all at once, because it didn't. Nothing real changes all at once, but over the weeks that followed, things moved slowly, steadily, the way the seasons move, in a way you only understand looking back. The kitchen became the warmest room in the house, not just in temperature, in the way that rooms become warm when they're used, genuinely used, for something that matters, by people who are actually present in them rather than just moving through. The ranch hands began lingering over meals. Not long these were working men with work to do, but longer than before. They started having opinions about what they liked. They started saying thank you and meaning it, not just as reflex. Dorothy, who had moved through the house for 20 years with the self-containment of a woman who had long ago decided she didn't need much from other people, began doing something that took Maribel a while to identify. She began asking questions, not many but some, about recipes, about technique, about where Maribel had learned certain things. Small questions that were really, underneath them, a kind of conversation. "Your mother teach you all of this?" Dorothy asked one afternoon, watching Maribel work on a pie crust. "Most of it," Maribel said. "Some I figured out myself. Some I got from a woman in town who used to cook for the hotel there." "What hotel?" "In Pratt County." Dorothy was quiet. "Then I worked in a hotel kitchen once, long time ago." Maribel glanced at her. "Where, St. Louis?" Dorothy said. Then, like she'd said more than she meant to, she went back to her own work and didn't say anything else for a while. But the question had been asked, and that was new. Elias began coming to the kitchen in the evenings. Not every evening, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Always for a reason, a question about supplies, a message for Dorothy, something practical. But the reasons were thin and they both knew it. He would stay for 10 or 15 minutes, mostly quiet, sometimes answering if Maribel asked something, occasionally saying something himself. Once he stood at the kitchen window, watching the last light leave the sky while she finished cleaning up, and neither of them said anything for nearly 20 minutes. And it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the particular ease of two people who have learned that they don't need to fill every silence. "You don't talk much," she said, one of those evenings. "Neither do you," he said. "I was raised that way. Not to talk unless you had something worth saying." "Same," he said. She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her, and for just a moment they were both simply there. Present, two people in a warm kitchen at the end of a long day, not pretending to be anything other than what they were. "How long were you married?" she asked. She hadn't asked before. She'd waited until it felt like the right question at the right moment, because she knew from her own life that some things can't be asked before they're ready to be answered. He was quiet for a moment, not withdrawing, just gathering. 8 years, he said. She died of fever, 12 years ago. "Were you happy?" Another pause. "Longer this time." "Yes," he said, "we were good together. Different in a lot of ways, but good together." "I'm glad," Maribel said simply, "that you had that." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've never been married," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "Close once, or I thought it might be close." It wasn't. She didn't elaborate, he didn't push, but she saw in his face that he understood the shape of it without needing the details, that he'd known enough of his own kind of loss to recognize loss in other forms. "Maribel," he said. She waited. "I'm glad you sent that letter," he said. She nodded once and turned back to the basin, but she was smiling just slightly, where he couldn't see it. And the kitchen held them both warm, ordinary, real, while the Montana dark pressed quiet against the windows, and the stars came out one by one over the mountains. The morning Maribel found the letter was the same morning she burned the cornbread. She never burned cornbread. In 32 years of cooking through kitchen fires and broken stoves and summers so hot the flour went bad before you could use it, she had never burned cornbread. It was the first thing her mother taught her, the thing she could make in her sleep, the thing she made when everything else felt uncertain, because at least that one thing she knew. But that morning she forgot about it entirely, because she was holding a piece of paper that had been slipped under the kitchen door sometime before dawn, and what was written on it had taken everything she thought she knew and turned it sideways. Dorothy was the one who pulled the pan from the stove. She did it without a word, set it on the cooling rack, looked at the blackened bottom of the bread, and then looked at Maribel standing frozen in the middle of the kitchen, with that paper in her hands. "What is it?" Dorothy said. Maribel handed it to her without speaking. Dorothy read it. Her jaw tightened. The note was unsigned, written in a hand that tried to look educated but pressed too hard on the pen, the handwriting of someone who was angry and trying to appear composed. It said, in the careful language of someone who wanted to wound without being caught wounding, "A man of Mr. Whitmore's standing deserves better than a woman who couldn't keep the interest of a Wichita merchant. Ask her what happened with Gerald Holt. Ask her why she was sent away." Dorothy set the paper down on the counter. She smoothed it flat with one hand, slowly, like she was deciding what to do with it. "Sent away," Maribel said. "That's the word they use now." "Who wrote this?" "I don't know," Maribel said. "It doesn't matter who wrote it. It matters that someone here knows the story." She pressed her lips together. "I didn't tell anyone. I never told anyone." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ruth Calloway's cousin talks to half the county." "Word travels." "I know it travels," Maribel said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. She set them flat on the counter beside the ruined cornbread. "I knew it would eventually. I just didn't know it would be this fast." "What do you want to do?" Dorothy said. That was the question, wasn't it? That was always the question. Maribel picked up the note, folded it once, and put it in her apron pocket. "I want to make breakfast," she said. "The men need to eat." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to the stove without another word, and Maribel started a new batch of cornbread, and the kitchen moved on the way kitchens always have to move on, because people need feeding regardless of what else is happening in the world. But her hands shook, just slightly, the whole time she was mixing. She didn't let Dorothy see. She had a lot of practice not letting people see. The note had found its mark, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, and that was its own kind of kindness. Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7, the way he'd been doing lately, coat already on, hat in hand. He looked at the two women working, and at the set of Maribel's shoulders, and said nothing immediately, because he was the kind of man who read a room before he spoke into it. "Coffee's on the table," Dorothy said, which was what she said every morning, and so he went to the table. But he watched Maribel through the doorway while he drank it. She didn't look back at him. She focused on the pan, on the batter, on the completely ordinary task of making food, which was the thing she always fell back on when everything else felt like it was cracking. He left without saying anything out of the ordinary. He had the north fence to check and a dispute with a neighboring rancher about water rights that had been building for weeks. He had a ranch to run. She understood that. She wasn't looking for him to rescue her from a piece of paper. But after he was gone, the kitchen felt a little larger than it had before, and she couldn't have explained why. By mid-morning, she'd found two more things. A comment from young Pete Harlan, one of the ranch hands, who had terrible gift of saying true things at the worst possible moments he mentioned, while refilling his coffee. that he'd heard a lady from Denver might be coming to visit at the end of the month. Friend of Mr. Whitmore's, somebody said. Pete offered, not unkindly, just the way young men share information, without understanding what it weighs. From his first wife's circle, I think, Maribel said. Is that right, in a tone that gave away nothing? Something Harrow, Pete said. Celeste, I think. Dorothy across the room did not visibly react, but Maribel noticed that she stirred her pot harder than she needed to. That was the second thing. The third thing was the mirror in the hallway. She passed it on her way to the pantry and made the mistake, without meaning to, of looking at herself as in it. Just a glance, just a second, but it was enough. She saw what she always saw, the plainness, the tiredness around her eyes, the worn quality of her skin, the total ordinary reality of her face, which would never in any possible version of events be described as beautiful. She thought about the note. She thought about Gerald Holt's face the moment he first saw her clearly, in daylight, without the softening effect of 2 months of careful letters. She thought about a woman named Celeste from Denver, from the circle of people who were born into the kind of world Elias Whitmore also inhabited, the world of society events and fine clothing and faces that photographers wanted to capture. She did not stand at the mirror long, but she stood there long enough. Long enough to feel the thing she'd been keeping carefully managed all morning break loose just a little and move through her chest like cold water. She put her hand flat on the wall beside the mirror. She breathed once, slow. Then she went to the pantry and got what she needed and went back to the kitchen. She was not her mother's daughter for nothing. Her mother, who had been plain as plain could be and had known it, and had built a life of such substance and warmth that people had traveled 30 miles to attend her funeral, not out of obligation, but because she had meant something to them. Her mother, who used to say, "The face you're born with is an accident. The person you become is a choice, make the better one." Maribel made biscuits that afternoon, an extra batch, unprompted, because 2 of the younger ranch hands had mentioned yesterday that they'd missed the Thursday biscuits. She made them and set them out, and watched those young men eat them with the particular attention of people tasting something that reminded them of somewhere they belonged. And she thought, This is what I do. This is what I have. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't a beautiful face or a society name or a history of being admired. But it was real, and it was hers, and she was good at it in a way that mattered to people. That had to be enough. The question was whether it would be. She was still trying to settle that question, when Dorothy came to find her near the end of the afternoon and said, without preamble, in her flattest and most careful voice, "She arrives Friday." Maribel did not need to ask who. Friday, she said. Elias got a wire this morning. He didn't mention it at breakfast, so I imagine he was figuring out how. Dorothy paused. He told me about it himself, at noon. I don't know what that means, and I'm not going to tell you it means something it might not mean. No, Maribel said, don't do that. What I will tell you is that I've worked in this house for 20 years, and I have never once seen him eat a full meal alone and then come back to the kitchen for no good reason, and stand around talking about nothing. Maribel said nothing. I'm not telling you anything, Dorothy said. I'm just saying what I've seen with my own eyes. And then she went back to the stove and left Maribel with that, which was its own very particular kind of kindness. That evening Elias came to the kitchen at his usual time. He had something to say. She could see it in the way he held his hat, turning the brim in his hands, which was something he did when he was working up to words he hadn't found yet. She waited. I should tell you something, he said. Celeste Harrow, she said. He looked at her. Dorothy told you, he said. Pete Harlan told me first, she said, this morning. He exhaled. The hat kept turning. She wrote and said she was passing through the territory and wanted to call. I didn't invite her, I know, Maribel said, but she's coming anyway, and I'm not sure how to. He stopped. Started again. She's from Margaret's world, my first wife. They were friends. Celeste has known me a long time. I understand, Maribel said, and she did. She understood completely what it meant when someone had known you before the grief, before the years of working alone, before the silence settled into your house and stayed. She understood how complicated that was. She was not going to make it simpler than it was, or pretend it was simpler than it was. I don't know her intentions, Elias said. You might not need to, Maribel said. She folded the cloth she'd been holding and set it on the counter. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Whitmore. Elias, I came here to build something, and I intend to build it. Whatever happens Friday, I'll still be here Saturday. He looked at her for a long time. You sure about that? He said. I'm sure, she said. I've been rejected by better men than anyone Celeste Harrow knows. It came out dry, with just enough edge, and for a moment it surprised them both. Then Elias did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Not a big laugh, a short, quiet one, the kind that happens when something catches a person off guard. But it was real, and it changed his face in a way that made him look younger and less tired and more himself. That's a hell of a thing to say, he said. I have a talent for those, she said. He shook his head slightly, still almost smiling, and looked at the floor, and then at her again. Maribel, he said. Don't, she said gently. Don't say anything that sounds like a promise you're not ready to make. I'd rather have an honest nothing than a kind. Something that doesn't mean what it sounds like. The kitchen was quiet. All right, he said after a moment. All right, she said back. He put his hat on and went back out into the evening. She stood in the kitchen alone, in the last of the warmth from the stove, and let herself feel just for a moment, just in the privacy of that room, the full weight of what Friday meant. Then she straightened her back and started cleaning up. Because Saturday was coming, and she intended to be there for it. Friday arrived with good weather, which seemed like a poor joke. The sky over the mountains was clear and brilliant, the kind of Montana afternoon that made everything look like a painting, and Celeste Harrow arrived into it like she'd been designed to be seen against it. Maribel did not go to the station. There was no reason for her to go to the station. She had work to do, and she did it, and she did not watch the clock, and she was not, she told herself firmly, in any way watching the window. Dorothy said, around 2 o'clock, they'll be back by 3, and went back to her work, and Maribel did not answer. She heard the wagon before she saw it. She was in the kitchen, because of course she was in the kitchen, and she heard the sound of it coming up the main path, and then voices, Elias's voice, low and measured as always, and then another voice, a woman's, with the particular music of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where people listened to what she said. Maribel did not go to the window, she stirred the pot. It took 20 minutes before anyone came to the kitchen. It was Dorothy who came first, with the kind of expression that meant she had assessed the situation and had opinions she was keeping to herself. She's in the parlor, Dorothy said. Elias is showing her the new horses. She seems to be very comfortable here. Maribel said nothing. She has very nice clothes, Dorothy said. I'm sure she does, Maribel said. Another pause. She asked who was managing the household now, Dorothy said. I told her you were here to help. Something in that phrasing, here to help, landed like a small stone dropped into still water. Maribel looked at Dorothy. Dorothy met her eyes steadily. That's what I said, Dorothy repeated. Because Elias hasn't announced anything, and it wasn't my place to announce it for him. You were right, Maribel said, and meant it. She turned back to the pot. What time is dinner? 6. Then let's make sure dinner is worth sitting down for. Dorothy nodded once, and they worked side by side, without speaking for a while, and the kitchen did what it always did, held them, steadily, in the warmth and the smell of something good being made. She heard Celeste Harrow before she met her. The voice moved through the house ahead of the woman, confident, carrying, the kind of voice that had never had to raise itself to be heard because it had always been listened to. Maribel could hear her in the hallway, talking to Elias about someone they apparently both knew in Denver, and laughing at something, and she had a laugh that was genuinely pretty, the kind of laugh that made you want to hear it again. Maribel cut the bread into even slices and kept her hands steady. Celeste came to the kitchen doorway at 5 o'clock. She stood there for a moment before saying anything, and Maribel turned and looked at her, because she was not going to be caught looking unprepared. Celeste Harrow was objectively a beautiful woman. Not in an exaggerated way, in the particular lasting way of someone who had good bone structure and knew what to do with it and had the resources to do it well. She was around 40, well-dressed, with the kind of posture that said she had never once in her life carried a heavy bag herself. She looked at Maribel with warm, perfectly composed eyes. "You must be the woman Elias brought in from Kansas," she said. Her voice was pleasant. The pleasantness was meticulous. "I am," Maribel said. "Maribel Dawson, you're Mrs. Harrow," Miss Celeste said with a small smile. "Widowed some years ago, like Elias." A pause timed well, like she was a musician who understood the value of silence. "It's wonderful that he found someone to help around the house. I always worried about him out here alone. He manages very well," Maribel said. "He's a capable man." "Oh, he is." Celeste slightly into the kitchen, the way a person moves into a space they've decided belongs to their general territory. "He's always been remarkable, since before Margaret died even. She used to say he could keep the whole world running and never ask anyone for help." "She sounds like she knew him well," Maribel said. "We all did," Celeste said. "That circle his world, Margaret's world, it's close-knit. You understand. People who've known each other a long time have a way of belonging together, I suppose you'd say." A shared history. Maribel looked at her directly. She had been looked at by experts. She knew exactly what this was. "That's a valuable thing," Maribel said. "History." "Isn't it?" Celeste said warmly. She left the kitchen a moment later, gliding back toward the parlor, and Dorothy, who had been perfectly silent at the stove throughout, waited exactly 3 seconds after the sound of her footsteps faded, and then said, without inflection, "Shared history." "Don't," Maribel said. "I'm not saying anything," Dorothy said. "Good," Maribel said. "Hand me the pepper." Dinner was at 6, and Maribel did not eat with them. She had not established any pattern of eating at the formal table. That was not the situation, not yet, and she was not going to force a situation into being that hadn't been invited. She ate in the kitchen with Dorothy, who ate in the kitchen by choice and had for 20 years, and they ate in their usual companionable quiet, while the sounds of dinner conversation moved distantly through the house. She couldn't hear the words, only the rhythm of it. Celeste's voice moving easily, Elias's answering more briefly, the pauses and returns of two people who had spent years in similar rooms. Dorothy finished her plate. Then she said, not looking at Maribel, "You should hear how he talked about you at noon today." Maribel looked up. "I went to take him a message about the water easement," Dorothy said. "He was talking to Tom Fenwick about, it doesn't matter what about. Tom asked him something about how things were going at the house, since people had been wondering." And Elias said. She stopped, considered. He said, "She's made this place feel like somewhere I want to come home to." Just like that, flat, like it was a plain fact. Maribel set her fork down. "He said that?" she said. "He said it to Tom Fenwick, who will repeat it to half the valley by Sunday," Dorothy said. "So yes, he said it, and he said it where it would be heard." Maribel picked her fork back up. She ate another bite. She was not going to cry in Dorothy's kitchen. She had more dignity than that. But her chest felt like something large and careful had shifted inside of it, the way a door shifts when someone finally touches it from the other side. After dinner, after Celeste had been shown to the guest room, she'd apparently requested specifically the large one, the one on the south side with the mountain view. Which was not the room Maribel was in, but was the nicer one. Elias appeared at the kitchen door. He looked tired in a specific way, not ranch work tired. The tired of someone who had been very carefully social for several hours, and was now paying for it. "She's settled," he said. "Good," Maribel said. "The dinner was exceptional," he said. "Dorothy did most of it," Maribel said. "She says you did the pie." "I did the pie." He stood in the doorway. There was something he wanted to say, and he was finding the path to it. "Celeste will be here until Monday," he said. "I know," Maribel said. She stopped. "She means well. I believe she means well. But she has ideas about what things should look like. What people should." He stopped again, the way he always stopped when words were being genuinely difficult for him. "I want you to know that whatever she says to you while she's here, it doesn't." "Elias," Maribel said quietly. He looked at her. "I can handle myself," she said. I've been doing it longer than you've known me. Something moved through his expression that she didn't quite have a name for. I know you can, he said. He exhaled. That's not why I'm saying it. The kitchen was very quiet. Then why are you saying it, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she felt the weight of it, the particular heaviness of a look from a man who doesn't look directly at things often, and is making an exception. Because I want you to know, he said, that what I said to Tom Fenwick at noon today, I meant it. She had to look away from him. She turned toward the basin, and she made herself breathe slowly, and she did not let him see what that cost her. Not because she was hiding something bad, because some things need a moment of privacy before they can be real. Get some sleep, she said when she could trust her voice. You've got a full day tomorrow, Maribel, he said. Good night, Elias, she said. He stood there for another moment. Then he said quietly, good night, and his footsteps moved away down the hall. She stood at the basin with the water running over her hands, the warmth of it steady and real, and thought about what it meant when a closed-off man said something like that to another man, in public, where it would be heard. Thought about it, let herself think about it. The next 2 days moved strangely. Celeste Harrow was unfailingly pleasant to everyone, and made Maribel feel, in the specific way of experts, like she was slightly in the wrong room at every moment. Not rudely, never rudely, but the comments came, small and well-placed, like pins pressed very gently into fabric remarking on the informality of certain arrangements, expressing kind surprise at the way things had changed since Margaret's time. Asking Maribel small questions about her background with a warmth so precise it felt like a measurement. On Saturday morning when Elias was out and Dorothy was doing laundry, Celeste found Maribel in the kitchen alone. She sat down at the table without being invited, which told Maribel everything she needed to know about how Celeste understood the geography of this house. Can I speak plainly? Celeste said. I'd prefer it, Maribel said. She kept her hands moving, kept working, because she was not going to give this woman the dignity of her full stillness. You seem like a capable woman, Celeste said genuinely. The food is wonderful. The men all speak highly of you. Dorothy seems to respect you, which means something because Dorothy doesn't respect most people. Maribel waited. But Elias Whitmore is a particular kind of man, Celeste said. He was built for a particular kind of life. He had it with Margaret, and losing it nearly broke him, and I watched that happen. Her voice dropped something, not warmth exactly, but the performance of warmth. What was underneath was something more honest, and Maribel thought more sad. He deserves to have that life again, with someone who fits. And you don't think I fit, Maribel said. I think you're good at what you do, Celeste said carefully. That's not what I asked, Maribel said. Celeste looked at her. For just a moment, under the composure, Maribel saw something, not cruelty exactly. Certainty, the unshakable certainty of a person who has never once in their life been the one who didn't fit, and truly cannot imagine what that is. I'm asking you to think about him, Celeste said. About what he needs, not just what might be convenient or comfortable for either of you. Maribel set down what she was holding. She turned fully and looked at Celeste Harrow. I have thought about what he needs, she said. I have thought about almost nothing else since I got here, if I'm being honest. And what I have seen with my own eyes in this house over these weeks is a man who was managing everything and feeling nothing and eating alone at a table built for 8 people. Her voice stayed even. Steady. She'd earned that steadiness over many years of practice. I have watched him start to laugh again. Start to stay in a room because he wanted to be there, not because he had business there. I have watched Dorothy Bell, who has worked in this house for 20 years and clearly given up on most people, start asking questions. I have watched ranch hands take their hats off when they say thank you. Celeste said nothing. I don't know what fits, Maribel said. I know what's true, and the true thing is that this house is warmer than it was 6 weeks ago. You can call that convenient if you want. The kitchen was completely still. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You love him." It wasn't what Maribel had expected her to say. She opened her mouth and closed it again. I'm not asking to be unkind, Celeste said, and her voice had changed, dropped the meticulous pleasantness, become something more real. More tired. I'm asking because I can see it, and I don't think you've said it to yourself yet. Maribel looked at the counter, at her hands. I care about this place, she said carefully. That's not what I asked, Celeste said. The silence stretched. That's none of your business, Maribel said finally, and it came out more raw than she'd intended. Celeste nodded slowly. She stood up from the table. She straightened her skirt, which didn't need straightening, and picked up the small cup she'd brought with her. For what it's worth, she said, at the doorway, I came here because I thought I was protecting him. I'm not entirely sure now who I was protecting. She left. Maribel stood alone in the kitchen for a very long time after that. She wasn't crying. She was past the kind of crying that comes from being attacked. This was something else, the particular stillness of a person who has just heard a truth they weren't ready for, spoken by someone who maybe wasn't entirely wrong. Dorothy came in 20 minutes later, took one look at her, and said nothing. She simply picked up a cloth and started helping clean up. That was its own kind of answer. On Sunday evening, the night before Celeste was to leave, Elias found Maribel on the back porch. She was sitting on the top step with her hands around a cup of cooling coffee, looking at nothing in particular. He came and sat down beside her, which was something he had not done before, sat beside her, physically, in the space she was occupying, without the buffer of a table or a counter between them. Neither of them spoke for a while. She said something to you, he said finally. Not a question. Several things, Maribel said. Some of them were fair. He looked at her. What did she say? That you're a particular kind of man built for a particular kind of life. She kept looking at the dark yard. She's not entirely wrong about that. What kind of life does she think I'm built for? The kind you had before, Maribel said, with Margaret. Society, a woman who fits that world, and she thinks that's what I want, he said. She thinks that's what you need, Maribel said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what do you think? She finally looked at him, at the side of his face, turned partly toward her, the tiredness in it that she had watched, over weeks, change its texture, go from the heavy, settled tiredness of a man sealed inside himself to something lighter. More alive. I think, she said slowly, that you know what you need better than she does. He turned and looked at her, and I think, she said, that you should think very carefully before you answer your own question, because I don't want you to tell me something that sounds like what I want to hear. I've had enough of that. I'd rather have the hard thing that's true than the easy thing that isn't. The yard was dark. The mountains were invisible. Somewhere out past the fence, cattle moved in the dark. Maribel, he said. Don't, she said for the second time in a week. Not tonight, think on it. She stood, picked up her cup, and went inside. But at the door she stopped. She didn't turn around. For the record, she said, to the dark and to him, whatever you decide, I'm glad I sent that letter. She went inside. He sat on the porch for a long time after. Celeste Harrow left Monday morning. She was gracious and composed and said all the right things, and when she said goodbye to Maribel, she held her hand for a moment and said, take care of him, with an expression that was complicated in ways Maribel didn't have time to fully decode. I intend to, Maribel said, and then she was gone. The house settled back into itself. The particular rhythm of the Whitmore ranch reasserted itself, the sounds of working men, Dorothy's measured footsteps, the stove, the cattle, the wind. That afternoon, Maribel made the extra batch of biscuits without being asked. She set them out at the midday meal and watched the ranch hands eat them with their usual focused gratitude, and young Pete Harlan took 3 and said, with his mouth half full, Miss Dawson, I don't know what we're going to do when you leave. He said it without thinking. He was 19. He said a lot of things without thinking. Maribel looked at him. I'm not going anywhere, Pete, she said. He swallowed, looked relieved. Good, he said simply, and went back to eating. She glanced up. Elias was across the room, leaning against the wall with a cup of coffee, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. She couldn't quite name it yet. It needed more time than she had at that exact moment to properly understand. but she recognized the feeling it gave her. It felt like something that had been held closed for a very long time. In both of them, beginning slowly, carefully, without forcing anything to open. 3 days after Celeste Harrow left, Maribel found Dorothy sitting at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, not cooking, not moving, just sitting with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes fixed on the wall. Dorothy never sat still. In 6 weeks, Maribel had never once seen the woman simply sit. Dorothy moved through the house like the house required it, like stillness was a luxury she didn't allow herself. So Maribel stopped in the doorway, looked at her, said nothing. Dorothy said, "Without turning, my daughter wrote." Maribel came in quietly and sat down across from her. She didn't ask anything. She had learned with Dorothy that questions were sometimes a wall and silence was sometimes a door. "She's in St. Louis," Dorothy said. "She married a man I never met. They have 2 children I've never seen." A pause. "She writes once a year. Sometimes twice. This one says the younger one started walking." Maribel looked at Dorothy's hands, still folded, very still. "His name is William," Dorothy said. "The baby. He has red hair," she says. "Lord knows where he got that from." "William's a good name," Maribel said. "It is," Dorothy said. They sat there together in the early dark kitchen. Outside, the ranch was beginning to stir the first sounds of the morning, men moving, horses. The stove needed lighting. There was breakfast to make for 20 people. Neither of them moved. "I left when she was 11, Dorothy said. "Her father wasn't. He wasn't a good man. I thought leaving was the right thing. Thought I could send for her once I was settled." She stopped. "I was settled within a year. But by then she was 12 and then 13, and there was always a reason it wasn't the right time." "Dorothy," Maribel said. "I'm not looking for comfort," Dorothy said flatly. "I'm just saying." She unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. Looked at them. "I'm saying it because you're going to make a decision soon. Maybe you don't know you're going to make it yet, but you are. And I want you to know that waiting for the right time is sometimes just another name for fear." Maribel looked at her. Dorothy stood up, moved to the stove, and began lighting it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times. The conversation apparently was over, but it landed. It sat down inside Maribel and didn't move. That morning Elias came to breakfast earlier than usual. He sat at the long table and ate the way he always did, focused, efficient, but when Maribel brought the coffee he looked up at her and said, "Ride with me today." She almost said no. Her instinct was to say no because yes meant something, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what yes meant. "The North Pasture," he said. "I want to check the Newfound's line. Tom Fenwick's been encroaching on the water access, and I want a second opinion on where the markers actually sit." "I don't know anything about property markers," she said. "No," he said. "But you know how to tell when someone's lying about where something is. I've noticed that about you." She looked at him for a moment. "Let me get my coat," she said. The ride out was the kind of quiet she had gotten used to with him, comfortable, undemanding, the kind of silence that had graduated from awkward to companionable, without either of them formally announcing the transition. He rode a dark horse and she rode a smaller bay that one of the hands had saddled for her without being asked, which told her that Pete or someone like him had anticipated this invitation before she had. The North Pasture was far enough out that they were alone in a way the ranch house never quite allowed. No Dorothy in the next room, no footsteps in the hall. No sense of other people moving through shared walls. Just grass and sky and 2 people on horses. She heard him exhale. Just once, slow. "How bad is the encroachment?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. "Fenwick's been shifting his markers a foot at a time for 2 years. It doesn't sound like much. Over 2 years it amounts to almost 300 yards of water access. Have you talked to him? 3 times. And each time he looks me in the eye and tells me I'm misremembering where the original markers were." "So he's lying," she said. "He is. What are you going to do about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I have a surveyor coming from Missoula next week. Official record. Whatever the survey says is what it says. And if he disputes the survey, then we go to the county," he said. "I've been patient about this. Patient has a limit. She looked at him. At the set of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who has decided something and is not going to be moved from it. Good, she said. He glanced at her. I mean it, she said. Patient has a limit. It's good that you know yours. He looked at her for a moment too long, given that they were both on moving horses, and then looked back at the path ahead. Something passed between them in that moment that neither of them named. But they both felt it. They were on their way back when they came across something that changed the shape of the day. A calf down in a ditch at the far edge of the north pasture, not dead, but not right either, lying at a bad angle, making the particular sound that animals make when they are scared and hurting and have been for a while. Elias was off his horse before Maribel had fully registered what she was seeing. She watched him go down into that ditch without hesitation, in his good coat, in the mud, and get his hands on that animal and start talking to it. Not commands, something quieter than that, something low and steady and almost gentle. The calf was tangled in old wire that had been buried under the grass remnant fencing, the dangerous kind that hid until something found it. Elias worked the wire loose with his bare hands, careful and methodical, and the calf fought him at first and then, gradually, stopped fighting. It took 20 minutes. His hands were bleeding by the end. He didn't mention it. He got the calf up, unsteady but standing, and let it find its footing. He watched it for a long moment to make sure it would hold. Maribel had stayed on her horse. She had known enough not to crowd the animal with extra bodies. But she had watched every second of it. When he climbed back up out of the ditch, muddy and blood-handed and completely unconcerned about either, she said, "Give me your hands." "It's fine," he said. "Elias," she said. He looked up at her. "Give me your hands," she said again. He did. She had clean cloth in her saddlebag. She had started carrying it after the kitchen incident. Because she had noticed that working ranches produced injuries with a regularity that the people who lived on them seemed to consider simply part of the schedule. She cleaned his hands as best she could on horseback, which wasn't perfect, but was better than nothing. "You're going to keep doing this," she said, working carefully on a cut on his right palm. "Getting calves out of ditches, hurting yourself and not saying anything about it." "It's part of the work," he said. "The work and your well-being aren't the same thing," she said. "The work can be done and you can also bleed less. These aren't mutually exclusive." He watched her hands working on his. "You always say exactly what you mean," he said. "I wasted a lot of time not saying what I meant," she said. "I'm too old for it now." "You're 32, he said. "I feel older than that." "So do I," he said. 42 feels a lot older than I expected 42 to feel." She tied off the cloth around the worst cut, looked up. Their faces were close in a way that the logistics of what she'd been doing had created without her entirely planning for it. She could see the tiredness in his eyes, and underneath it, something that the tiredness had been covering for a long time, something that was becoming harder to cover. She leaned back. "We should get back," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for exactly 1 second longer than was strictly necessary. Then they turned the horses and went. That evening, Maribel was writing a letter at the small desk in her room when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main hallway. Not loud enough to make out words, but raised, which was so unusual in this house that the sound itself was wrong. She set down her pen and listened. One voice was Elias. The other was a man she didn't recognize. She waited. The voices ran for another 2 minutes, and then a door closed hard, not quite a slam but close, and then footsteps moved through the house, and then nothing. She went back to her letter. 10 minutes later, Elias knocked on her open door. He looked the way he always looked after something had cost him, controlled, but tightly, the way a fist is controlled. Clenched. "That was Reverend Aldgate," he said. She turned in her chair. "From town," he said. "He wanted to discuss the nature of your presence here." A pause. He used the word improper. Maribel looked at him steadily. "He's the second person this week," Elias said. "Tom Fenwick's wife made a comment to Dorothy at the market. And there was another note this morning. I don't know if you knew about the first note." "I knew," she said. Something moved through his expression. "Dorothy told me." She shouldn't have worried you with it. It's my house, he said. It worries me. He came a few steps into the room and stopped. I've been thinking about how to say this correctly. She waited. I don't want there to be any question, he said, about why you're here. About what this is, he stopped again. His jaw was tight. I haven't been a man who talks about personal things easily. You know that I do, she said, but I'm aware that my not talking about it has left things unclear. And unclear has given people room to fill in what they like. And what they've liked to fill in has not been. He stopped. Exhaled. It hasn't been fair to you, Elias, she said. I'd like to speak to Pastor Williams in Redstone Valley, he said. About a proper arrangement, formal, if that's something you're willing to consider. The room was absolutely still. She looked at him, at his face, which was trying very hard to be composed and mostly managing it, except for something around the eyes that wasn't composed at all. That's a considerable thing to ask, she said. I know. We've known each other 6 weeks. I know, he said again. I know that, and I'm not asking you to decide this moment. I'm asking you to. He stopped. Tried again. I'm asking you to know that I'm asking. She looked at her hands, at the letter she'd been writing, a letter to Ruth Calloway, who had started all of this with a fence conversation and a cousin in Montana. She'd been telling Ruth that things were going well. That Montana was larger than she'd expected, that the mountains had a way of making everything feel different. She'd been trying for 3 paragraphs to explain Elias without explaining him, and failing. I'm going to need some time, she said. You can have all the time you need, he said. That's easy to say, she said. It's less easy when the thing requiring time involves another person who's also waiting on an answer. I'll wait, he said, with a simplicity that hit her somewhere beneath the ribs. She looked up at him. Why, she said, and she meant it as a real question. Not rhetorical, not fishing for something. She genuinely wanted to know what, in his own words, he would say. He was quiet for a long moment. Because the house was quiet before you got here, he said. And I didn't know it was quiet. I thought that was just what a house was. He looked at his bandaged hand. And now I know the difference. Maribel pressed her lips together. She nodded once. Give me a few days, she said. He nodded, picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the edge of her door, and went. She sat at the small desk for a long time after. Then she picked up her pen and started the letter over, because the one she'd been writing was no longer accurate. The few days she'd asked for did not turn out to be quiet days. Maribel had a sense, almost immediately, that something was coming, not because of anything specific she could point to, but because she had grown up in a small town and understood the way communities worked when they had decided to have an opinion. The pressure was building the way weather builds. You could feel it before it arrived. On Wednesday, 2 women from the church auxiliary came to call. They were polite. They were concerned. They had a friend whose cousin had once been in a similar arrangement, and it had caused significant scandal, and they simply felt, as neighbors and as women of faith, that they had a responsibility to share their perspective. Maribel served them coffee and listened without interrupting, which was something she had learned from her mother, and which was not, in fact, capitulation. It was intelligence gathering. She thanked them for their visit. She said she would reflect on their concerns. She walked them to the door and watched them leave, and then went back to the kitchen and told Dorothy what they'd said. Dorothy said, That's all you've got?" Maribel said. "They came to your kitchen," Dorothy said, "not his office." "That means they thought you'd be easier to move than him." "They were wrong. They might try him next," Maribel said. "Let them," Dorothy said. "He handled Reverend Aldgate in 4 minutes." "He can handle 2 church ladies," Maribel almost smiled. But the pressure kept building. On Thursday, one of the ranch hands, not Pete, but an older man named Carl, who had worked on several ranches across the territory and had the rough social confidence of someone who believed longevity gave him the right to comment, said, within her earshot at the midday meal, that it was funny, wasn't it, how some women came in through the back door and tried to move to the front. He wasn't talking to her, he was talking to the man next to him. But he knew she was there. She set down the water pitcher she was carrying. She turned. She looked at Carl directly. "Carl," she said. He looked up. He hadn't expected her to turn it into a conversation. "If you have something to say about my situation in this house," she said, "I'd appreciate you saying it to my face so I have the chance to answer it." "I'm not much for indirect conversation." The table went quiet. Carl looked at her for a moment. He was a man who was used to being the one who made other people uncomfortable, not the one sitting in the discomfort. "Didn't mean anything by it," he said. "Then you won't mind not saying it again," she said. She picked up the pitcher and kept moving. Pete Harlan, 2 seats down, was looking at his plate with the very intense focus of someone who was trying extremely hard not to look at anything else. But the corner of his mouth was doing something that looked like it wanted to be a smile. That night she heard from Dorothy that Carl had gone to Elias directly and complained. She waited to hear what Elias had said. Elias had said, "Then find somewhere else to eat." She heard this and stood still for a moment in the middle of the kitchen. Dorothy looked at her. "Don't read too much into it," she said, which was absolutely Dorothy's way of saying, read everything into it. It was on Friday that the real storm arrived. She had been expecting something. She hadn't expected this exact shape. Elias found her in the kitchen at mid-morning, with a look she hadn't seen on him before, not the controlled tightness of irritation, but something colder. The kind of cold that happens when a person has been genuinely blindsided. "I need to show you something," he said. He handed her a letter. It was from a man in Wichita named Gerald Holt. She read it with her hands steady because she had practice. Gerald Holt had written to Elias Whitmore, not to her, to him to inform him, in the careful language of a man who wants to destroy something while appearing to preserve it, that Maribel Dawson had a history that Mr. Whitmore deserved to know about, that she had presented herself to Holt 3 years earlier as a woman of good character and simple background, and had in fact been pursuing him for financial security. And when he had discovered the nature of her intentions, he had ended the arrangement, and she had not taken it well, and there had been considerable talk in the community. All of it built on the frame of one true thing, that there had been an arrangement, and that it had ended, and constructed around that frame a story that was almost unrecognizable. She read it twice, then she set it on the counter. "I know what you're going to ask," she said. "I'm not asking anything yet," Elias said. "I wanted you to see it first. He wrote to you, because he knew I'd never know if he hadn't," she said. "Because I'd have no way to defend myself against a story told behind my back." She looked at Elias. "Is that not exactly what someone does when they know the truth won't survive contact with the person it's about?" Elias said nothing. He was watching her face. "Here is what is true," she said. "Gerald Holt and I exchanged letters for 2 months. He came to Pratt County. He met me. He decided I was not what he wanted. He left. He told people afterward that I had been chasing his money." She paused. "I was not chasing his money. I was hoping to build a life. Those are not the same thing, and I won't pretend they are." "Did you love him?" Elias said. The question caught her off guard. "No," she said. "I thought maybe I could. I never got close enough to find out." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Why is he writing now?" he said. "Because someone told him about me being here," she said. Someone wanted him to. She felt the click of it settling into place. The note. Whoever sent the note under the door knew about Gerald. They also knew Gerald well enough to contact him. That's not a coincidence. Elias went very still. "Celeste," he said. "Not quite a question." "I'm not saying that," Maribel said. "I don't know." "I'm saying it," Elias said, and his voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard from him before. Quiet. The voice of a man making a precise decision. He picked up the letter. "I'm going to write back to Gerald Holt," he said. "And I'm going to tell him that I received his letter, and that I have spoken directly with Maribel Dawson, and that I find his account to be the account of a man who has confused his own failings with someone else's character." She stared at him, and then he said, "I am going to write to Celeste." "Elias, I should have said something sooner," he said. "I have been careful. I am always careful. I have been careful for 12 years, and careful has let other people say things that should have been corrected a long time ago. He looked at her. I'm done being careful in that direction. She couldn't speak for a moment. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't have to, he said. That's not why I'm doing it. She pressed her hand flat on the counter. Looked at it. Looked at him. Gerald Holt is a small man, she said. He's always going to tell that story because it's the only version of it where he looks acceptable. I know, Elias said. This isn't going to fix that, she said. No, Elias said. But it fixes something else. And she understood, looking at him standing there with that letter in his hand, and something decided and unmoving in his face, that the something else was her. That he was fixing the record for her, drawing a line in public in writing where it could be seen. She looked away. She was not going to cry in the kitchen. She had principles, but it was close. Write your letters, she said. Her voice was thicker than she wanted it to be. I will, he said. He went to his study. She heard the door close. She stood in the kitchen and put both hands on the counter and breathed until she had herself back. Dorothy, who had been in the pantry the entire time and had clearly heard everything, came out carrying a sack of flour she absolutely did not need at that moment. Well, Dorothy said. Don't, Maribel said. I'm just saying, well, Dorothy said. Well, Maribel said. They looked at each other. Then Dorothy set the flour down and said, he's a good man. I know, Maribel said. You know what else I know, Dorothy said. Don't. I know you've already made your decision, Dorothy said. You made it before he even asked. You've just been afraid to let yourself have something good. The kitchen was quiet. Maribel looked at the counter. At her hands, at the flour sack Dorothy had set down for no reason. I've been disappointed before, she said, very quietly. The honest thing, the thing beneath the other things. I know, Dorothy said, with a gentleness that didn't belong to the usual Dorothy and therefore hit harder than it would have from anyone else. What if I'm wrong about this? Maribel said. What if I let myself have it and it turns out I was wrong? Dorothy was quiet for a moment, then she said, what if you're right? The words sat there between them, small and devastating. Maribel closed her eyes, 1 second, 2. Then she opened them and picked up the flour sack. We need bread for tomorrow, she said. We do, Dorothy said, moving to help. They worked in the kitchen as the afternoon light moved across the floor, and neither of them said anything more about it, and that was exactly right, because some things don't need more words than what's already been said. What followed in the next 2 weeks was a particular kind of tension that Maribel had not encountered before, not the tension of conflict, but the tension of two people who have said almost everything they needed to say and are now living inside the pause before the next step is taken. Elias had written his letters. She didn't ask what they said exactly. She knew what they said. The doing of it was the thing that mattered, not the words. Gerald Holt did not write back. She hadn't expected him to. From Celeste, a brief note came, not to Elias, to her. 3 lines. It said, I believe I misjudged the situation. I hope you will consider that I had genuine concern for someone I care about, even if the expression of it was wrong. I wish you well, Miss Dawson. And then, below that, a line that made Maribel read it twice. He hasn't laughed in years. Not the way you make him laugh. I noticed that. She showed it to no one. She folded it and put it in the box where she kept her mother's recipe book. The things she wanted to keep. Then on a Sunday evening in the middle of October, when the nights had gone sharp and cold and the first edge of Montana winter was pressing against the ranch, Elias sat down across from her at the kitchen table, not Dorothy's table, the big dining table, and put both hands flat on the surface and said, I'd like an answer, Maribel. If you're ready. She looked at him. The kitchen light was warm behind her. Through the hall, she could hear distantly the ranch settling into its nighttime sounds. She thought about the train platform, the moment she'd braced for and the moment that hadn't come. The suitcase taken out of her hand. You must be tired. She thought about biscuits and burned cornbread and a calf in a ditch and a man cleaning his own bloody hands in a muddy coat. She thought about a letter written at midnight in her dead mother's kitchen, sent in the dark before she could change her mind. She thought about what Dorothy had said. What if you're right? Yes, she said, just that one word. But Elias Whitmore, who was not a man given to expression, looked at her across that table, and something came into his face that she had never seen there before, something that was not managed, not composed, not carefully held. Something that was simply there, open real. "All right," he said. Quietly, like something that had been held tight for a long time had been allowed finally to release. "All right," she said back. Outside, the October wind moved over the Montana grass, and the stars came out over the mountains. And inside the Whitmore ranch, the kitchen was warm, and for the first time in longer than either of them could accurately measure. Neither of them was alone in the way they had each, separately, been alone. It was not a grand moment. It was the quietest moment Maribel had ever had. And it was the most important one, they told Pastor Williams on a Monday. By Thursday, the entire valley knew Maribel had expected talk. She'd lived her whole life in small communities, and she understood that an announcement like this, Elias Whitmore, the wealthiest and most private man in the Bitterroot Valley, marrying a plain woman from Kansas who'd arrived 6 weeks earlier with a worn suitcase and no family name worth mentioning, was not the kind of thing that passed through a community quietly. She had prepared herself for the comments, the sideways looks, the particular social temperature of people who had opinions and intended to share them. What she had not prepared for was Agnes Whitmore. Elias had a sister. Maribel had known this in the abstract way you know things from letters mentioned once, briefly, in their early correspondence, described only as living in Helena, doesn't involve herself in ranch business. She had constructed from this a vague picture of a woman who kept a polite distance. What arrived at the ranch on Thursday morning was something else entirely. Agnes Whitmore was 54 years old, tall, and had the particular energy of a woman who had been managing other people's situations her entire life and considered this a calling rather than an interference. She did not ride ahead. She simply arrived by wagon from the station, with 2 large bags, and the manner of someone who had already assessed the situation from a distance, and was now here to address it in person. Maribel was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon. She heard Elias go to the door. She heard a woman's voice, warm and carrying and absolutely certain of its welcome. She heard Elias say, "Agnes, I didn't know you were coming." And Agnes's voice, affectionate and steamrolling in equal measure. "Of course you didn't. If I'd written, you'd have found a way to tell me it wasn't necessary. Put my bags inside, Elias. The wind's something fierce today." Dorothy, beside Maribel at the stove, said nothing. But she began stirring with the expression of someone who had witnessed this particular force of nature before and was making peace with it. "That bad," Maribel said quietly. "She means well," Dorothy said, which was the same thing she'd said about Celeste, but in an entirely different tone. Where Celeste had gotten a careful pause before the words, Agnes got something warmer and more resigned. Like the difference between a difficult stranger and a difficult family member who you'd nevertheless chosen to keep. Agnes appeared in the kitchen doorway approximately 4 minutes after arriving, which was barely enough time to set her bags down and remove her coat. She was not what Maribel expected. She had expected someone who looked like a female version of Elias, contained, measured, economical with expression. Agnes had the same strong bone structure and the same directness in her eyes, but where Elias pointed those things inward, Agnes pointed them outward at everything and everyone in her immediate vicinity, with the full intensity of a lantern held up to see better in the dark. She looked at Maribel, and Maribel looked back at her. "You're Maribel," Agnes said. "I am," Maribel said. "I'm Agnes. We should talk." She looked at Dorothy. "Dorothy, how are you? You look exactly the same, which is remarkable." "Where's Elias?" "Dealing with your bags," Dorothy said. "Good. Give us a minute." Agnes turned back to Maribel with the focused attention of someone who had made a decision to take a thing seriously and was now taking it seriously. "Sit down." Maribel sat. She had learned in 32 years the difference between a command that was a power play and a command that was simply how some people organize the world. Agnes was the second kind. Agnes sat across from her and looked at her with the frank, thorough assessment of someone who was not going to waste either of their time being indirect. My brother, Agnes said, has not written a personal letter to a single member of this family in 11 years. Not since Margaret died. He sends Christmas cards. He sends money when people need it. He does not write letters. She paused. He wrote me a letter last week. Maribel said nothing. It was 3 pages, Agnes said. Elias, who has been known to communicate the status of entire seasons of cattle ranching in 4 sentences, wrote me 3 pages. Another pause. They were mostly about the fence dispute with Tom Fenwick, which I understand is genuinely important. But he managed to mention you 7 times in the course of explaining a property line disagreement. Maribel looked at her hands. 7, Agnes said. I counted. Mrs. Maribel started. Agnes, she said, and I'm not finished, but she said it without sharpness. She said it like someone who needed to get through something important and was going to do it at the pace it required. I loved my sister-in-law. Margaret was one of the best people I have ever known. And when she died, I watched my brother put himself in a box and nail it shut from the inside. 12 years. She looked at Maribel directly. I had started to believe he was going to stay in that box. Maribel looked up. He's not in the box anymore, Agnes said. Flat factual, like she was reporting the weather. The kitchen was very quiet. I need you to understand something, Agnes said, leaning forward slightly. I am not here to interrogate you. I am not here to make sure you're good enough. That is not my business. And also I already know the answer, because Elias does not make mistakes about people. He simply avoids them. I am here because I have been worried about my brother for 11 years, and last week I got a letter that for the first time in 11 years made me stop worrying. She sat back. I wanted to see it for myself, and Maribel said. Agnes studied her for a moment. Dorothy, she said, without looking away from Maribel, this kitchen smells better than it did the last time I was here. Maribel reorganized the herb storage, Dorothy said. I can tell, Agnes said. She was still looking at Maribel. You did that. First week, Maribel said. The first week, Agnes said. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, because it hadn't been hard to begin with, but settled. Decided. All right, she said. Good. Now tell me about yourself. Not the letter version, the real version, so Maribel told her. She told her about Kansas and her mother, and 11 years of caregiving, and what that did to a person, the particular way it both builds you and wears you, the way you learn everything about patience and almost nothing about yourself. She told her about Gerald Holt, plainly and without drama, the true version without the story Gerald had built around it. She told her about sending the letter to Elias at midnight before she could think better of it. She told her about stepping off the train expecting a particular kind of moment and getting a different one entirely. Agnes listened. She did not interrupt, which Maribel suspected was a genuine exercise in restraint. When Maribel finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He took your suitcase. Yes, Maribel said. That's not, people don't know this about him, because he doesn't perform anything, but that's not nothing for Elias. He's not a man who reaches toward people, I know, Maribel said. He reached toward you in the first 10 minutes, Agnes said. Maribel said nothing, but she felt it, the truth of it, landing in a new way when said by someone who had known him all his life. Agnes stood up. She smoothed her skirt with both hands, a gesture that Maribel recognized from Elias, the same settling motion he made with his hat when he was finishing a decision. Welcome to the family, Agnes said. It was so simple and so direct and so entirely lacking in ceremony that Maribel blinked. I haven't, she started. We haven't, I know, Agnes said. But you will, and when you do, you'll already be family, so we might as well start the clock now. She moved toward the door. Now where is my brother? I have opinions about the Fenwick situation that I've been holding since his letter, and I need somewhere to put them. She swept out of the kitchen as thoroughly as she'd swept into it. Dorothy watched the empty doorway for a moment, then she said, Which was, Maribel had come to understand, Dorothy's version of well. That went better than it could have. Agnes stayed for a week. It was an eventful week. On the first day, she went with Elias to meet with the surveyor from Missoula and reportedly had opinions about the property markers that the surveyor found extremely useful and that Tom Fenwick found extremely unwelcome. On the second day, she reorganized Elias's study with his permission, grudgingly given into a configuration that she insisted was more functional, and that Elias spent 2 days adjusting back to something in between her version and his. On the third day, she sat in the kitchen with Maribel for 3 hours and went through her mother's recipe book, page by page, asking questions about each one with the focused interest of someone who was actually going to use the information. "This one," she said, pointing to a recipe for molasses cake written in Maribel's mother's rounded, careful hand. "What makes it different from a regular molasses cake?" "The proportion of spice," Maribel said, "and she always added a tablespoon of strong coffee to the batter. You don't taste it as coffee, but it deepens everything else." "Show me," Agnes said. So they made the cake together in the Whitmore Ranch kitchen, and Dorothy watched from across the room with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. When it came out right, and it came out exactly right, the way her mother's always had, Agnes cut a piece and ate it standing at the counter, and then said quietly, "My mother used to make something like this." It was the first personal thing she had said all week. Maribel looked at her. "Did she?" Maribel said. "She passed when Elias was 15, Agnes said. "I was 21. I'd already been cooking for the family 3 years by then." She set her plate down. "She never wrote anything down. I've been trying to reconstruct her recipes from memory for 30 years. I get some of them right and some of them," she stopped. "Some of them I can't quite find." Maribel looked at the recipe book. "Tell me what you remember," she said. "We'll find it." Agnes looked at her for a moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "People say that," Maribel said. "They mean it as a compliment," Agnes said. "Even when they don't know how to say it right." "I know," Maribel said. "I've gotten good at hearing it that way." Agnes made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Not quite, but close enough." On the fourth day, the thing happened that changed the week's temperature entirely. Maribel had been in town her first time, going to Redstone Valley proper, in the company of Agnes and Dorothy, to the general store and the market. It had been fine. The town was small, and everyone in it knew who she was and was in various stages of deciding what to make of her, and she had simply been herself, which was the only strategy she had, and which, in her experience, was also the only one that worked over time. She had just gotten back. She was in the hallway, still in her coat, when she heard it. Elias's voice from the study, and another voice she didn't immediately recognize. A man's voice, with the particular rhythm of someone who believed what he was saying, and also believed he was the most important person in the conversation. She wasn't trying to listen, but the study door was not entirely closed, and the voices were not low. "I'm telling you this as a friend," the man's voice said. "As someone who has known you since before Margaret. The county is watching this, Elias. A man in your position, taking up with a woman of no family, no standing, a woman who, from what I understand, made herself available for a similar arrangement in Kansas and was rejected." "Stop," Elias said. The other voice paused, started again with the confidence of someone who expected to continue regardless. "You have a reputation in this valley that took 20 years to build. Whatever affection you may have developed, it cannot be worth." "James said." The voice stopped. Elias's voice had gone very quiet. Maribel had learned that this was when he was most serious. Not when he was loud. He was never loud in the way some men were loud. When he was most serious, his voice went down. "I'm going to say this once," Elias said. "Maribel Dawson is going to be my wife. This is decided. It is not a question I am entertaining debate on. If that changes something between you and me, then I am sorry for that, because I have valued our friendship. But it does not change what I have decided. Are we clear?" Complete silence. Then the other voice, considerably flatter than before, "You're certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything since I decided to build this ranch," Elias said. Maribel stood absolutely still in the hallway. She heard the other man stand. She heard the restrained performance of a graceful retreat, the "thank you for your time," the "I hope you'll consider," the carefully managed exit of a man who had lost ground and was trying to leave it looking like a choice. She moved away from the hallway before he came out. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and breathed. Dorothy came in from the pantry, saw her face, and said nothing. Agnes came in 30 seconds later from the direction of the parlor, which meant she had also heard, and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and an expression that was the closest thing to outright satisfaction Maribel had seen on her. "That was Robert Caldwell," Agnes said. "He's been telling Elias what to do since they were 20. Elias has been letting him because it was easier than arguing." She paused. "Right up until this moment, apparently." Maribel pressed both hands flat on the counter. "I have never been more certain of anything since I decided to build this ranch," she repeated, very quietly, to herself. "You weren't supposed to hear that," Agnes said. "I know," Maribel said. "But you did." Agnes looked at her steadily. And Maribel looked up. "And I need to go talk to Elias." Agnes stepped out of the doorway. She found him in the study. He was standing at the window, which is what he did when something needed processing. He heard her come in and turned. He looked at her face. "You heard," he said. "I wasn't trying to," she said. "I know." He crossed the room and stopped a few feet from her. "I should have said those things directly to you, before I said them to anyone else." "You said them where they needed to be said," she said. "That matters too, Maribel." He stopped. He was trying to find words the way he always had to try for them, working against his own nature. And she waited, because she knew this was a man for whom the trying was itself a form of honesty. "I know you have had people promise you things, and then step back from them. I know you have learned to wait for the proof before you trust the word." She said nothing. "I want you to have the proof," he said. "I'm not asking you to take the word alone. I understand why you can't. But I want you to know that I meant what I told Robert Caldwell, and I meant what I said to you at the table, and those two things are the same thing. I don't have a public version and a private version. I just have the one." She looked at him for a long time. "I know you don't," she said finally, quietly. "That's the thing I noticed about you first." Something in him eased. She could see it, the particular release of a man who has been holding a thing carefully and has just been told he can set it down. "The wedding," she said. "I want something simple." "I don't need a performance." "Agreed," he said immediately. "No hesitation, and I want Dorothy there, not as staff." As a guest, he looked at her, of course, and Agnes, she said. "Agnes will be impossible to exclude regardless," he said, which was so dry and so exactly true that she laughed before she could stop herself. He looked startled not by the laugh, but by the sound of it in this room, in his study, which had been a room without laughter for many years. "I like your sister," Maribel said. "God help you," he said. But the way he said it, the warmth underneath the wryness, told her everything about how he actually felt. "She loves you," Maribel said, "very much, in her particular way." "I know," he said. "You're lucky," she said. "Not everyone has that." He looked at her. "I know that too." She nodded once. "Turn toward the door, Maribel," he said. She turned back. He crossed the room. He stopped directly in front of her, closer than he usually stood, which, for Elias Whitmore, was itself a declaration, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks, except without the careful layer of management he usually kept over it. Then he did something she didn't expect. He took her hand. Just that. Her right hand in both of his, the ones she'd bandaged twice now, the working hands of a man who built things and held it for a moment without saying anything. She felt it go through her, the warmth of it, the realness of it. "I'm glad you sent the letter," he said. "You've said that before," she said. "I'll probably say it again," he said. She looked at his hands holding hers. "I'm glad I sent it too," she said. First time she'd said it back. And she meant it completely, without qualification, in a way she hadn't been able to mean it until this moment, in this room. With his hands around hers and the Fenwick dispute resolved and Robert Caldwell's retreating footsteps finally gone from the house. He let go of her hand. She went back to the kitchen. She made the molasses cake again that afternoon, with Agnes, and this time they talked about Agnes's mother, and the things she remembered about her, and Dorothy came and sat at the table, actually sat. Not stood and contributed a detail about a pie crust that opened a whole branch of conversation, and the three of them were in the kitchen when Elias came in at the end of the afternoon, stopped in the doorway, and looked at the three of them, the kitchen full of warmth and smell and voice, with an expression that Maribel caught before he composed it. She had never seen that expression on his face before. She didn't have a word for it. The closest she could get was home. They were married on a Saturday in early November, in the small church in Redstone Valley, with Pastor Williams presiding and approximately 40 people in the pews, which was more than Maribel had expected, but fewer than the valley would have liked. Because Elias had insisted on simple and meant it. Dorothy sat in the second row in a dark blue dress that Maribel had not known she owned. Agnes sat in the first row and cried, which she had promised herself she would not do and did anyway, and managed to make even the crying look somewhat authoritative. Pete Harlan was there with his hat in his lap and his best attempt at a clean shirt. Most of the ranch hands had come. Carl was not among them, having left the ranch 2 weeks earlier for circumstances that no one discussed in detail. Maribel wore a dress she had ordered from Missoula in a warm brown that Agnes had helped her choose, over her initial instinct, which had been for something gray and practical. "You're getting married," Agnes had said, with the infinite patience of someone with no patience whatsoever. "Choose the one that makes you look like someone who belongs there." She had chosen the brown. She did not even now think of herself as beautiful. That was not the word she would ever have for herself, and she had made her complete peace with that. But she looked, in Agnes's word, like she belonged, like this was a thing she had a right to. This moment, this dress, this church. This man standing at the front of it, watching her walk toward him, with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing it did, when he was trying not to show too much and failing. He was failing considerably. She reached him. She looked at him. "You're nervous," she said, very quietly, just for him. "I'm aware," he said. "Don't be," she said. "Easy to say," he said. "Elias." He looked at her. "I'm here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Something settled in him. She saw it happen, the particular release she'd learned to recognize in him, the moment where he stopped managing and started simply being present. "All right," he said. "All right," she said back. Pastor Williams began. Outside, the November wind moved over the Montana grass, and the mountains were white at their tops, and the valley went on in every direction as far as could be seen, enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful. Inside, Maribel Dawson said yes for the second time, and this time there were 40 witnesses and a church and a man whose voice didn't waver. And Dorothy Bell, in the second row, cried for only the second time in 20 years, and didn't try to hide it. The first months of their marriage had a particular quality that Maribel hadn't anticipated, not difficult, not easy, but real in a way she'd never had anything be real before. It was the realness of two people who had spent long years living entirely inside their own habits and rhythms and were now learning to make room in those habits for another person without losing themselves. Elias was quiet in the mornings. She learned quickly that this was not mood, it was simply the way he came back to himself after sleep, slowly like a fire that needed time before it was warm. She stopped trying to talk to him before his second cup of coffee, and he stopped looking vaguely surprised that she was in the kitchen when he came downstairs. And these two adjustments were made within the first week, and after that the mornings ran smoothly. She had a habit, he discovered, of reorganizing things when she was thinking through a problem. He came home twice in the first month to find the pantries entirely rearranged, and once to find that the account books on his desk had been sorted into a different order that was, he admitted after examining it, actually more logical than what he'd had before. He did not ask her to stop. He simply started noting where he'd left things before he left them. These were small things. They were also not small things. They were the things that a life is actually built from. The larger things came too. In January, the Fenwick dispute was settled by the county survey in Elias's favor, 300 yards of water access restored, and the handshake that ended it was the coolest handshake Maribel had ever witnessed two men perform, but it was done. And it was binding, and Elias came home from it and said only, "It's finished," and she put a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down, and they looked at each other across the table with the shared satisfaction of people who had been through something together and come out the other side of it. In February, Dorothy's daughter wrote again. This time the letter was longer. There was talk, carefully phrased, of possibly visiting in the spring. Dorothy read it twice in the kitchen and then put it in her apron pocket and went back to work. And Maribel said nothing except later, "The guest room on the south side is the nicest one. If you wanted it free for May." Dorothy had looked at her for a long moment. "I haven't said she's coming," Dorothy said. "I know," Maribel said. Another pause. May would be fine, Dorothy said. In March, Maribel's kitchen baked goods began reaching the market. It had started simply Agnes, on her second visit, had suggested it as something so obvious she couldn't believe it hadn't happened yet, and Maribel had resisted for reasons that, examined later, amounted to not quite believing her work was worth the assertion required to offer it publicly. Agnes had not accepted this reasoning for a single second. The first Saturday, she set up at the Redstone Valley Market with 24 loaves of bread, 3 dozen biscuits, and 4 pies. She was not sure what to expect. By noon, she had sold everything. The woman at the neighboring stall, who sold preserves and had been doing it for 15 years and knew what a good Saturday looked like, leaned over and said, "You'll want to bring more next week." "How much more?" Maribel asked. "Double," the woman said. At least, she brought double the next week. She sold that too. Elias came with her to the third Saturday. He did not help. This was not what she needed, but he stood nearby with his coffee and watched people come to the table and come back again. Watched the women of the valley handle her bread, with the particular hands of people who understood what went into making it. Watched her talk to them with the ease that she had the plain, genuine ease of someone who was simply herself in every situation, and something in his face did the thing it had done the day he'd looked at the 3 women in his kitchen. She caught him looking on the way home. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then you didn't know," he said. "When you came here, you didn't know what you were bringing." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "You came thinking you were coming to be useful," he said. "To manage a house, to be adequate. You said as much in your letter." He looked at the road ahead of them. "You had no idea you were going to walk into a valley and become something it needed." She stared at him. "That's a considerable thing to say," she said. "I've been thinking it for a while," he said. "I thought I should say it out loud." She looked at her hands in her lap, at the empty baskets stacked behind them in the wagon emptied by the valley's women who had come back again and again to her table. "I was just making what I know how to make," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the thing about it." She didn't answer. She looked at the mountains, the ones she'd watched, come closer on the train, the ones she'd pressed her forehead to the glass to see, the ones that had been so much larger than she expected and still were. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Kansas, about the cold in the walls and the blank page, and the pen she'd lifted and set down more times than she could count. She thought about the letter. One honest letter sent in the dark before she could change her mind. "I almost didn't send it," she said. "I know," Elias said. "You couldn't have known that," she said. "I could tell. From the letter," he said. "I could tell it cost you something to send it. That was the part that made me know you were someone worth answering." She absorbed that. "You decided from one letter," she said. "I decided from one honest letter," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him, at the side of his face, familiar now in a way that had happened gradually, and then all at once the way most real things happen. "What if it had gone wrong?" she said. "I'd have survived it," he said. "I've survived worse." "So would I," she said. "I've survived worse too." "I know," he said. "That's why it didn't go wrong." She thought about that for the rest of the ride home. About what it meant, the idea that the surviving was the thing that made them capable of the arriving. That all those years of loss and disappointment and endurance hadn't been prologue to something better but preparation for it. When they pulled into the ranch, Pete Harlan came out to take the horses, saw the empty baskets, and said, "Sold out again," with a grin that took up most of his young face. "Every last one," Maribel said. "I keep telling the boys," Pete said, "that we've got the best cook in the whole territory living right here, and we ought to be grateful every single day." Pete, Elias said. Sir, you're right, Elias said simply. He climbed down from the wagon, offered his hand to Maribel, and walked with her into the house. Behind them, Pete Harlan watched with the particular expression of a 19-year-old who has just witnessed something he doesn't have the vocabulary for yet, but will remember for a very long time. Inside the ranch was warm. The kitchen smelled like the morning's bread. Dorothy had left a pot of soup on the back of the stove, the kind of thing she did without announcement or attribution, just quietly present, like everything Dorothy did. Elias hung up his coat, Maribel hung up hers beside it. She looked at the two coats, side by side on the hooks by the door. Such a simple thing, such an ordinary, unremarkable daily thing. She felt it go all the way through her. I'm going to check the accounts, Elias said, moving toward the study. Dinner in an hour, she said. I'll be there, he said. He would be. He always was. She went to the kitchen and lifted the lid on Dorothy's soup and breathed in the steam and thought about all the morning she had stood in her mother's kitchen in Kansas and wondered if there was a life on the other side of the one she was already living. There had been. There was. And it smelled, on this particular Tuesday in March of 1885, exactly like warm soup in a kitchen she had made her own, in a house full of people who, one by one and for their own various reasons, had decided she was worth staying for. That was everything. That was in fact more than everything. She picked up a spoon and started to cook. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in April, tucked between a supply invoice and a note from Agnes about her planned summer visit. Maribel almost missed it. She was sorting the morning mail at the kitchen table, something she had taken on gradually, the way she had taken on most things in this house. Not by announcement, but by simply being the person who was there and reliable, when she saw the envelope with the Kansas postmark and the handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it. It was from a young woman named Clara Briggs, 24 years old, from a town 2 counties over from where Maribel had grown up. Someone had given Clara her name, she didn't say who, just a woman who knew a woman who said you might understand. Clara wrote that she had been corresponding with a rancher in Wyoming, that the arrangement seemed decent and the man seemed honest, that she was ready to go, but she couldn't make herself pack. She wrote, I am not beautiful, and I have been told my whole life that this means I should expect less. I don't know how to stop believing that. I don't know how a woman like me walks into a situation like this without already knowing she's going to be sent back. Maribel read it twice, then she set it flat on the table and pressed her hand over it. Dorothy came in from the pantry, looked at her face, and said nothing for a moment. No, Maribel said, the opposite. She picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in her apron pocket. Then she went to find Elias. He was in the barn, which was where he went when he had thinking to do that required his hands to be busy. She found him repairing a length of harness leather, with the focused quiet of a man who had been doing this particular kind of work his whole life. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face while he read, watched the way he processed things carefully, without rushing to a reaction. When he finished, he handed it back. How old did you say she is? He said. 24, Maribel said. He nodded slowly. What are you going to do? Right back, she said. I wanted to tell you first. He looked at her. Why tell me? Because I'm going to tell her something true, she said. And the truest version of it involves you. I thought you should know before I put it in a letter. He held her gaze for a moment. Tell her what she needs to hear, he said. She nodded. Maribel, he said. She looked back. He had gone back to the harness, hands working. He didn't look up. Tell her about the suitcase, he said. She stood still for a second. I will, she said. She went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table and wrote Clara Briggs a letter that took her 2 hours and 3 drafts. Because the first 2 were too careful and too measured and too much like the advice a person gives when they're still protecting themselves from the vulnerability of what they actually know. The 3rd draft was the honest one. She wrote about stepping off the train, expecting the look and not getting it. She wrote about the suitcase and the 2 words, you must be tired, and what those 2 words had done to a woman who had spent years braced for something different. She wrote about burned cornbread and unsigned notes, and a woman named Celeste who had arrived to reclaim something she'd already lost. She wrote about what it felt like to say yes across a table to a man who had waited for the answer without ever once making her feel the weight of the waiting. She wrote, "I cannot promise you it will go the way mine did. I can only tell you that the version of yourself who writes an honest letter and gets on a train is someone worth becoming, regardless of what she finds at the other end." The woman who stayed in Kansas was afraid of the look. The woman who got on the train found out the look wasn't the whole story. Those are not the same woman, and the distance between them is one decision. She wrote, "Come if you're willing, and when you step off that train, stand up straight. Not because you're not afraid. You will be afraid. Stand up straight, because you deserve to take up the space you're standing in." She sealed it and gave it to Pete Harlan to take to the post, because Pete was going to town anyway, and she trusted him not to read it, which was more than she could say about some people. Then she made coffee and sat at the table, and thought about what it meant that there was a Clara Briggs in Kansas who had found her way to Maribel's name. Dorothy came and sat across from her without being invited. She poured herself coffee. She looked at the wall for a moment. "You wrote her back," she said. "I did," Maribel said. "What did you tell her?" Maribel thought about it. "I told her the truth," she said. Dorothy nodded slowly. "The whole truth, as much of it as fit in a letter," Maribel said. They sat with that for a moment. "My daughter comes in 6 weeks," Dorothy said. "I know," Maribel said. "I haven't seen her," and Dorothy stopped. Pressed her lips together. "It'll be 11 years in June." "I know," Maribel said. Dorothy picked up her cup. Set it back down. Her hands, Maribel noticed, were not entirely steady. Dorothy's hands were never unsteady. She had hands that had done 30 years of hard kitchen work without shaking. "What if she looks at me and doesn't? What if it's been too long?" Dorothy said. She said it the way people say the thing they've been not saying, fast and flat, and then immediately after, the expression of a woman who has just handed someone something fragile and is waiting to see if they'll drop it. Maribel looked at her. "She's coming," Maribel said. "After 11 years, she's coming. She could have kept writing once-a-year letters forever, and she chose to come instead." She paused. "That's your daughter deciding the distance is over. She already made the decision. You just have to be there when she arrives." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. "That's simple," she said. "I didn't say it was simple," Maribel said. "I said that's what it is." Dorothy picked up her cup again. This time she drank from it. Her hands had steadied. She said, which was Maribel had come to understand over the course of 1 year in this house, the truest thing Dorothy Bell ever said. Clara Briggs wrote back 2 weeks later. She was going to Wyoming. She had already booked the train. She wrote, "I read your letter 4 times. I'm still scared, but I packed the bag." Maribel read it at the kitchen table and then walked to the barn and told Elias, who was there again with the harness or possibly a different piece of leather. It didn't matter. He was always doing something with his hands when he needed to think. "She's going," Maribel said. He looked up, he said. "She says she's still scared. She should be," he said. "It would be strange if she wasn't. That's what I told her," Maribel said. He set down what he was holding and looked at her directly. "You didn't tell her it would be fine," he said. "Not a question." "I told her the truth," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Then did you tell her about the suitcase?" "I did," she said. Something moved through his expression. She had learned to read all the small things his face did, that he didn't know it was doing the specific way he looked when something mattered to him that he hadn't planned on mattering. This was that. "She'll remember that," he said, "when she gets there." "I hope so," Maribel said. He picked up the leather again. His way of saying the conversation was complete in the way that felt whole rather than cut off. She stood in the barn doorway a moment longer. "Elias." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. He frowned slightly. "For what?" "For the suitcase," she said, "the first day." "I never said it directly." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't need to," he said. "I know," she said. I wanted to anyway. She went back inside. Behind her, she heard him set the leather down again. She did not turn around. But she knew the sound of a man stopping what he's doing, because something has just asked him to be fully still for a moment. She understood it. She had been having those moments all year. The spring moved forward the way Montana spring does, tentatively at first, and then all at once, as if it had been saving itself. The ranch work shifted its character with the season. The days grew longer. The kitchen windows let in more light. Dorothy's daughter arrived on a Thursday in May. Her name was Rose, and she was 32 years old, and she had her mother's bone structure and her own way of holding herself careful but not closed. The way of someone who had made decisions about her life and lived with them and was still living with them, and had decided that being here, in this place, with this woman, was one more decision she was ready to make. Maribel had prepared the south guest room. She had put fresh herbs from the kitchen garden in a small jar on the table, because it was the thing she knew how to do, make a place feel like someone was expected and wanted. She did not go to the station. She understood without being told that Dorothy needed that arrival to be only hers. 11 years of letters and once-a-year news, and a grandchild named William, who had red hair and had just started walking. 11 years of managed distance needed the space of an unwatched reunion to collapse properly. She was in the kitchen when they came in. She heard Dorothy's voice first, not the kitchen Dorothy, not the measured and careful Dorothy, but a voice she had never heard before. Softer, younger, the voice of a woman who has put down something extremely heavy. She heard a younger woman's voice answer. She heard then a silence that was not empty. The particular silence of two people standing in the same space after too long apart, past the words, inside the thing that words were never going to be enough for anyway. Maribel made tea. When they came to the kitchen 20 minutes later, Dorothy's eyes were red and her posture was absolutely perfect, which was how she carried every private thing. Rose had Dorothy's eyes and a steadier expression than her mother, and she shook Maribel's hand with both of hers and said, "She talks about you in her letters." "Does she?" Maribel said, looking at Dorothy. "She says you know what you're doing?" Rose said. "That's high praise from your mother," Maribel said. Dorothy said, "Don't make a thing of it," which was her way of confirming it was a thing. They had dinner that evening, all of them, at the long table, the table that had been built for a family and had slowly, over the past year, been discovering what that meant. Elias at the head, Maribel beside him, Dorothy and Rose across. Agnes had come down from Helena for the occasion with 2 days' notice and the absolute certainty that her presence was both welcome and necessary, which it was. Pete Harlan had been invited because Maribel had invited him, and because he had been the one, all those months ago, who said he didn't know what they'd do when she left, and she wanted him at the table that proved she hadn't. The conversation was loud by Whitmore Ranch standards, which meant it was moderate by any other standard. But the table was full and the food was good, and at one point Agnes said something about the Fenwick property dispute that made Elias laugh, really laugh, the way Maribel had come to know his laugh. Unexpected and genuine, and over quickly but real. And Rose looked at Dorothy with an expression that asked the question, and Dorothy gave the smallest possible nod which answered it. Maribel saw the whole exchange from across the table, and looked down at her plate and let herself feel the fullness of it. Not the triumph of it, the fullness, the simple, unremarkable, extraordinary fullness of a table where everyone had chosen to be there. After dinner, after Rose and Dorothy had gone to the parlor to talk, after Pete had gone home with half a pie that Maribel had wrapped for him without asking, because she had learned that Pete Harlan would never ask for anything but would always be grateful. After Agnes had excused herself with the declaration that she was tired, even though she was obviously going to read in the parlor for another 2 hours, Elias and Maribel were alone in the kitchen. This was not unusual. This was, in fact, their hour, the end of the day, the kitchen, the winding down of everything that had happened since morning. He was at the table. She was cleaning up. Neither of them needed to fill it with words. After a while he said, "Good day." "Yes," she said. "Dorothy," he said. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then you planned this," she turned. "Planned what?" "The guest room, the dinner, Pete, Agnes." He looked at her. You built this evening. I cooked dinner, she said. Maribel, she looked at him. You built it, he said simply. Not as an accusation, as a recognition. She set down the cloth she was holding. I wanted Dorothy to have her daughter back and not be doing it alone in an empty kitchen. I wanted Pete at a table where someone was glad he was there. I wanted Rose to see what her mother had built here. She paused. I wanted a full table. We have a full table, he said. We do, she said. He stood up and came around to her side and stopped in front of her. He was not a man who made grand gestures. She had known this from the beginning and loved it about him, the particular solidity of a man whose small gestures were therefore always real. He put his hand on the side of her face, just that. His palm against her cheek, his thumb along her jaw, his working raw hand steady and warm. She covered his hand with hers and held it there. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. I have been thinking all day about how to say this correctly, he said, and I've concluded there isn't a correct way, so I'm going to say the plain version. I prefer the plain version, she said. I know you do, he said. That's part of what I mean. He held her gaze. A year ago I was a man who had everything, and none of it meant what it was supposed to mean. I knew how to run a ranch. I knew how to manage land and livestock and accounts. I had forgotten entirely what it felt like to be somewhere I actually wanted to be. He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. You didn't fix that. I want to be accurate. You didn't fix it. I'm not something that was broken and got repaired. But you being here in this house, at this table, he stopped again. You reminded me what the point of it was, all of it. The land, the house, the work. I had forgotten what it was for. She pressed his hand more firmly against her cheek. Elias, she said. I'm not finished, he said. She waited. I know you came here, not knowing if you'd be enough, he said. I know you packed that bag expecting to be sent back. I know every time someone in this valley looked at you sideways you stood there and held your chin level, and I know what that costs, because I have watched you do it, and I am not an unobservant man. He looked at her with the full force of a man who has been quiet for most of his life and has decided that right now, in this kitchen, in this moment, he is going to say the whole thing. You are the most sufficient person I have ever met in my life. Not in spite of what you thought you lacked, because of what you knew you had and were willing to offer anyway. She felt it go through her completely, all the way down. To the place where the Gerald Holt of it lived, and the blank pages at midnight, and the worn suitcase, and 32 years of believing that enough was probably the most she could hope to be. Her eyes stung. She was not going to cry in this kitchen. She had said that before. She was also going to cry in this kitchen. Both things were true. You are a very difficult man, she said, because her voice needed a moment, and the wry thing was easier to start with, to have a simple evening with. He was not smiling, but he was close. She knew the close by now. You cried, he said. I'm not crying, she said. You are, he said. I'm expressing strong emotion in a way that happens to involve my eyes, she said. He made a sound that was absolutely a laugh, quiet and real. And she leaned forward and put her head against his chest, and he put both arms around her, and the kitchen held them the way it had been holding people all year, steadily, warmly, without asking anything in return. She breathed. She thought about Clara Briggs on a train to Wyoming. She thought about Rose sitting in the parlor with Dorothy, hearing 11 years of distance collapse into the same room. She thought about Pete Harlan carrying half a pie home in the dark. She thought about a letter written at midnight in a cold Kansas kitchen. One honest letter. That was all it had been. One decision made before she could talk herself out of it, sent in the dark to a stranger she had no reason to trust. And look what it had made. After a while she lifted her head. He looked at her, this man, this steady, difficult, hand-call-used, harness repairing, cattle-keeping, once-in-a-lifetime man, and she looked back at him. I want to write to her, she said. Clara, he said. When she gets to Wyoming, she said, I want to write and ask how it went. I want her to know someone's asking, he nodded. Write to her. And if it doesn't go well, she said, I want her to know she can write back and we'll figure out what comes next. He looked at her for a moment. We, he said. We, she said. Something in his face settled into itself completely. Every managed, careful, contained thing he had carried for 12 years settling into its right position, like the last piece of a fence line properly staked. "Write to her," he said again. "Tell her she's not alone." That was the word, that was the one. Not beautiful. Not sufficient. Not even enough. Not alone. She stepped back, picked up her cloth, and finished cleaning the kitchen. He sat at the table and didn't pretend he had anywhere else to be. The lamps were warm. The house around them was alive in the way a house is alive when it has been filled correctly, not sufficient, but with people who had chosen it and been chosen by it in return. In the parlor, Dorothy was laughing. A real laugh, the kind Maribel had heard from her exactly twice in a year, and both times had felt like a rare weather event, something to stop and notice. Elias heard it too. He looked toward the hallway. "I didn't know she could do that," he said. "Neither did I," Maribel said, "until you know someone well enough to give them a reason." He turned and looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was folding the cloth with the precise attention she gave to everything. Nothing careless, nothing half done, everything worthy of the full weight of her hands. He watched her for a moment. "Maribel," he said. "I know," she said. She hadn't let him say it. "You always do that," he said. "You always telegraph it," she said. "What do I telegraph?" She set the cloth down, turned to face him fully. "The way you say my name before the thing you actually want to say." She looked at him steadily. "You say my name and then you say the thing. I always know the thing is coming. I just let you say my name first because I know it helps you get there." He stared at her. She looked back at him with the calm, plain, unsentimental directness that had been hers since before he knew her and would be hers long after. "Say it," she said. "Whatever it is." He was quiet for exactly one moment. "I love you," he said. Plain, no architecture around it. No careful placement. Just the words. Delivered the way he delivered everything that mattered, without decoration, without hedge, with the full weight of a man who did not say things he did not mean. The kitchen was completely still. Maribel looked at him. At this man who had taken a worn suitcase from a stranger's hand on a train platform and changed the direction of both their lives with 2 words and a willingness to simply show up. She thought about everything it had taken to get to this kitchen. All the years of it, all the cost of it, she thought worth it. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting until you caught up." He shook his head, almost smiling. Close, and then over that line, into the actual thing, the real, unguarded smile that she had seen grow more frequent over the year, like a season returning. "You are a difficult woman," he said. "I know," she said. "I wouldn't change it," he said. "I know that too," she said. She turned to the stove to check the banked fire. He stayed at the table. Somewhere down the hall, Dorothy laughed again, and this time Rose's voice followed it, and the two sounds wound together in the warm air of the house, like something that had always belonged there, finally finding the room that fit. This was the Whitmore Ranch on a Thursday evening in May of 1885. Not the version that would be described in the county paper, which would call it a prosperous operation under capable management. Not the version that strangers would encounter, which was a well-run property with excellent food, and a woman at its center who seemed to know everyone's name. Not the version that people who had once doubted it would eventually admit they'd been wrong about, though they would, and they did. This was the real version, a man at a kitchen table, a woman at a stove, a house full of people who had chosen, each in their own specific and difficult way, to stop being alone and start being somewhere. And at the center of all of it, not because she was beautiful, not because she was extraordinary in any way that the world had been taught to recognize as extraordinary, a woman from Kansas who had written one honest letter in the dark and gotten on a train. A woman who had walked into a stranger's house with a worn suitcase and no guarantee, and had simply quietly, with capable hands and a plain face and more courage than anyone would ever give her credit for, built something that endured. She had come looking for enough. She had built something magnificent. And she had done it the only way that anything real has ever been built, not by being what the world wanted her to be, but by being, completely and without apology, exactly what she was.